So this is the second grant workshop of a series of 4. Last week's workshop is required to watch. If you didn't watch that one, make sure you go back and look at that one. These next 3 workshops are not necessarily required, but a good opportunity for everybody to learn more about the process. And really the intent here is to really try to coach our community through these steps. These things, developing grant projects can be complicated. And so, some of this information presented today will likely not be new information for some of you, but for some others, it may be new. And so please, put your questions in the chat as you have them, and we'll try to have an extra long Q&A session here at the end of this to answer any questions that may come up. So meeting etiquette, please do stay muted during my talk here today. I would appreciate if cameras were kept off, at least for the portion of my talk, to save bandwidth. Full disclosure too, we've been having several power surges and internet issues at the office here at Station 91. And so if during this presentation, if I go away and the meeting cuts off, we will plan to reschedule this workshop at a later date when the weather's a little better. But just full disclosure there, we will try to work through this with some internet issues. And again, if you have any questions, put them in the chat or raise your hand at the end of the presentation at the Q&A session, and we'll get those questions answered for you. So today we're going to talk about really steps to developing a project. We like to start here with our community and talk through this process. So what are the steps to creating a project, and what does that mean from a collaboration standpoint with the community, writing a scope of work, developing a budget, and making sure you're ready to implement. Quick overview again of the Wildfire Prevention Grant Program funded by Measure T. This is a community wildfire prevention fund, and as such, we are looking to to fund projects that provide greater community benefits. And so it really is intended for multiple landowners or even single large landowners to bring projects to the district that don't just benefit the individual landowner, but have greater community benefits for wildfire risk reduction and better preparing our communities for wildfire. I mentioned this last week, I'm here to help you think pragmatically about your ideas and how they may fit the program, and help give you direction on how to complete the application process in a competitive way. The district and myself, we're not here to design projects for you. We want creative ideas from our community that we are excited to fund. And we do love this program because it does spur a lot of interest and enthusiasm, but we do encourage you all today as we work through this and through these other workshops that we do to really critically assess whether your project aligns with the goals of this program and the procedural guide before starting the application process. Understanding that, we do have a lot of Measure T programs available to the community. And if your idea doesn't quite fit the grant program, or if you're questioning if it does, come talk to our dedicated wildfire prevention team here at Truckee Fire. We always want to know how we can better support your community with Measure T. Okay, we'll get right into it here. So I like to start this conversation with, steps to creating a grant project. And this is specific to a grant project, not every project. So number one, I highly recommend that if you're starting from scratch with an idea, reach out to us, reach out to Truckee Fire. I am here. I am a registered professional forester in the state of California and the assistant wildfire prevention manager at Truckee Fire. My name's Dillon Sheedy. I should have introduced myself at the beginning. My apologies, but I think most of you know me. So I really am the subject matter expert at the district for this grant program, and for forestry ideas and concepts and moving projects from inception to finish, the whole process. I'm very familiar with it, and I'm happy to meet with you in person, on site, on your property, and discuss what a grant project might look like and how to go through that process. I recommend you start there if you are starting from scratch with an idea and not really a developed project. The next step is really the most important step, and sometimes takes the longest out of all the other processes here. But community collaboration and coordination is critical, and we'll talk in depth more about this. But really, this starts with understanding where your community and your neighbors are at. And when I say community, I'm not talking about the entire town of Truckee. I'm talking about your community locally, your neighbors and your adjacent neighbors. Who is interested in participating in a project? What are their concerns? Are they worried about this type of work? Or do they not generally support this work? Do they support this work and they are really concerned about certain issues in the forest or in the community? And think about what type of project would best serve your community. I think it's imperative that we involve our neighbors in the design of these projects, and communication is key. This process is very important. It's worth a lot of points in our grant program. We want, again, collaborative projects that provide greater community benefits. And we can't achieve that unless we're involving our neighbors in these conversations and these ideas. Step number 3, if your project includes a forest fuel reduction component, you should be contacting a registered professional forester. Any project in California proposed on a forested landscape requires a registered professional forester to design and oversee any fuel hazard reduction vegetation removal. And this is state law. So there are no exceptions to this in California. If you are proposing any actions on forested landscapes, you need to have a registered professional forester helping you. A forester can also help develop your project. They can help you make maps. They can help you write prescriptions and understand options for environmental compliance pathways and what those associated costs are. We really do need our community as a whole to start embracing this process with the forester. We live in a beautiful place that is forested, and it requires careful attention from these professionals to design projects that do not cause significant adverse impacts to the environment. And that is what foresters that are trained to do in the state of California. The next step, if your project does not include a forest fuels reduction component, if you're proposing an educational project or a community wildfire preparedness project, you could probably skip this step. You don't necessarily need a registered professional forester, but what is your expertise in that area? Do you need to reach out to someone in your community that has more experience implementing a project that you are proposing? Get help. Reach out to some nonprofit organizations and see if they can run with your idea. So that's an important distinction there, between forest fuels reduction projects and other projects. We mentioned this in the first webinar, and I just hammered that down again. You must have a forester for forest fuels reduction projects for all of these reasons listed. The next step is really to develop a scope of work and a detailed prescription. And we'll talk about that in depth later here in this presentation. And then you want to kind of start thinking about your budget and what is your budget going to look like. This could include soliciting quotes from contractors, general contractors, licensed timber operators, loggers, understanding what the cost is for a forester and their time, and really starting to develop that budget based off of information you've gathered from your community on what project you want to do, what is your scope of work, and then what is that scope of work going to cost to the grant. The next step would be to complete environmental permitting. And I think this is important. Again, we need our community to understand that local government and federal government, the government is not going to be able to solve all of these problems and pay for all of this work. This really is a shared effort with our community. And so environmental permitting is a big thing. Um, I would say that if you want to be competitive and you are an active landowner and you are committed to stewardship on your property, you should be paying for this out of your own pocket. You should be paying for a forester to assess your land and to complete a permit for you. That way, you can package up a project that is very competitive and ready to be implemented now and present that to these governmental organizations such as Truckee Fire or the state, and make it so we can't say no. Right, man, this landowner has already hired a forester. They have a forest management plan. The forester, they've paid for the permit. The permit's ready to go. How can we say no to this? Like, this is a perfect project, right? And that's where you want to get with this. And we need our community to understand that, we do not have funding to pay for every single step of this process. And it does require investments from private property owners to make this process happen and to be competitive in these grant projects. The last step would be to write and submit an application. This is basically obviously an arbitrary list subjective to my opinion. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think this is a good place to start for a lot of people. If you have not communicated with your community and achieved some level of community understanding and address their concerns, you probably shouldn't be starting to work on a budget at that point, right? You still have a lot of work to do to get your neighbors and your community on board with this project to implement it. So let's talk about each of those in turn. So acquiring community support, as mentioned earlier, this is the hardest part of any project and can take the most time. I have projects that I implement where I am working with 100 different landowners and executing right of entry agreements for every single landowner. I can tell you that this process can take 1 to 2 years to get buy-in, get support, and to be able to move forward on a project based off of the buy-in of the community and whether or not they're willing to have the work done. This is not something that you're going to get through in a couple of weeks. There's going to be a lot of concerns from the community. There's going to be a lot of opinions, and I'm here as a resource if you need me at those meetings to talk through why we want to propose these types of projects and why they're important. So this can sometimes be too much work for one person. So I would suggest that you develop a committee or you work within the confines of your HOA and use HOA contact lists or even your Firewise community. It's important to use these communications channels to stay engaged with the community early and stay engaged throughout the process. Nobody likes poor communication and surprises, right? We want no surprises through this process. It's important to have clear goals and objectives and make sure they resonate with your community. There are many other benefits to this type of work other than just fire mitigation. This improves forest health. It can improve wildlife habitat. These are projects that are truly the spirit of ecological restoration. So what types of goals and objectives resonate with your community? I encourage walk-in talks, community meetings, gain support, hear concerns, invite us to these meetings. Let's be involved. And then be prepared to adjust your project prescription or the location based on feedback from your community and your neighbors. It is inevitable that some people will say no, and that's going to be a hard no, and it's going to be pretty hard to change some people's opinions on that, and that's okay. I think you just got to move on and work with people that want this work completed and understand the importance of it and are willing to have the work done on their property. Don't spend a bunch of time with people that are not interested at all. And when you do acquire that support, you want to get letters of support and commitment. So let's talk about those. Letters of support are recommended, they're not required. And these are letters from supporting entities, supporting neighbors that support the project. They are not from individual or entities that are already primary project partners. And we'll talk about what a primary project partner is. These letters, you don't necessarily need to solicit every single community member or business to support your project. I mean, think about the appropriate level to demonstrate support. Do you have a Firewise community adjacent to the project you're proposing? Is that Firewise community willing to write you a letter of support for your project? Is your project going to interface with multiple private landowners? And you should probably have a conversation with those landowners and try to get letters of support. And those are not required, but they should be signed by the landowner or by a professional entity that supports the project. And that is a great way to show local support. Letters of commitment are a little bit different. Again, these are primary project partners. So primary project partners are individuals or entities who will have work performed directly on their property and or are monetarily supporting the project through cash match or in-kind contributions and or are professionally supporting the project. So anybody that is having work done on their private property or are contributing match, and this professionally supporting the project, this could be your forester who is committing to the project or another subject matter expert that you've retained to help you. These letters of commitment act as a kind of type of right of entry agreement between the applicant and the landowners where you're proposing the work to be done. It's very common for these projects in this type of grant world where we're proposing projects that aren't going to occur on our property. They're maybe occurring on other pieces of private property. And so it's imperative that you get letters of commitment from these landowners stating that they've been contacted, that they are willing to have the work as outlined in the application performed on their property, how much funding they can provide, and that they support the project. And this is legally binding, in my opinion. You're writing a signed letter, and we have had to pull this out of the dockets and use this when we've had issues with landowners who have signed letters of commitment and then decide down the road that they're not interested anymore. And I'm sorry, but once you sign this letter of commitment and you move forward with this project, there is no turning back at that point. So this is a very serious thing to consider if you are signing these letters of commitment, because we are committing funding and we are permitting this project. And when we permit, we have obligations to the state to carry this project through in a certain timeline. And once you sign this letter of commitment, you cannot change your mind based off of your opinions of how the work looks. Like, you are committed to the project at that point. The last part for collaboration and local support, local support really is best demonstrated by the degree to which the project provides in-kind match or cash match. So match is not required to apply to the program, but the existence of match greater than 20% of the direct cost do result in more points. This is a community fund, and we can only achieve our wildfire resiliency goals if we work together and combine resources. So this year, a little bit different, match may be either in kind, which means basically, so take, for example, a private landowner who is submitting a grant has an obligation to now be the project manager, and your time spent managing that project, reporting to Truckee Fire, and overseeing the contractor, doing all the work required to see that project through, would count as in-kind match through volunteer project management at a rate of $31.50 an hour, I believe is the current rate for volunteers in California. So in-kind match, this is not hard cash match, can only be achieved through volunteer project management work. Hard cash match is money either from private landowners or other grants that are directly implemented into the project. If you do have match, you should list that match in the application and make it clear in the scope of work, or sorry, in the make it clear in the letter of commitment what that match amount is that the landowner is committing. Again, we hold people to this number. Okay, so to wrap this up, collaboration and local support. This is straight out of the procedural guide. Okay, it is worth 10 points. It's worth a lot of points. This is the evaluation criteria. I'm not going to read it. It's in the procedural guide very clearly, but I just want to call out the match points. We just talked about this. This is not required, but this is what the review team is looking at. If you have no match, you will get 0 points in that category for match. If you have anything less than 20% match, it's 1 point. If you have 20% match, you get 2 points. If you have greater than 20% match, you get 3 points out of this 10. So the rest of those points are awarded based on your letters of support, your letters of commitment, and your answer to the application to how you involve the community in your project design. The next step is to contact a professional. So you've gone through this effort, you've met with your community, you've worked through community concerns, people are on board, you've got some letters of support, letters of commitment. You're feeling good about this project. Again, per this grant program and per state law, any project under forest fuel reduction requires an RPF. So we have a statewide consulting RPF list online. We also provide a local list for reference on our website. Your forester is going to need to sign a letter of commitment, basically stating their involvement in the project. And you can budget for this time. Although, as I mentioned earlier, it would be preferred for this cost to be covered by cash match from the landowner and not paid for by grant funding. If your project is not a forest fuel reduction project, which does not require an RPF, then what? Well, you should consider your own expertise in the subject, or if someone in your community is experienced with the type of project you're proposing, you should develop a relationship with that person and work with them. If you don't feel like that's the case, there's many local organizations who may be interested in your idea. We've got some nonprofit organizations, community foundations, other, Tahoe Prosperity Center, these organizations that, they may be interested in your idea, and maybe they can take it and run with it and help you through that process and be kind of a project manager in a way for you. And then, also consider, like, are there other ways that Measure T can support your community? And if so, we want to know. So moving on to the scope of work, this is a really important piece. So in the world of grant writing, grants and being successful with grants is all about maximizing your points that you can possibly get and telling a good story. And really, the scope of work is your main opportunity to sell your project to the review committee. This is a very detailed description of your project, what you're proposing, what are the metrics, all these things. And this is really what the review committee focuses in on, is the scope of work. So spend time on this. And the scope of work must address the following. So again, this is verbatim out of the procedural guide. So you should be describing the geographic scope of the project, the names of the specific communities that it will benefit, and you want to describe the goals, objectives, and expected outcomes of the project. Let's break that down a little bit. There is a clear difference between goals and objectives, right? Goals are usually broad, they're long-term aspirations, right? So a goal could be we want to reduce wildfire risk, or we want to improve community safety and awareness. So those would be larger, broad goals. Objectives are more specific, measurable, and actionable steps to achieve these goals. So if you're saying that you want to improve community safety and awareness as your goal, maybe your objective is to provide workshops, outreach programs, resources to educate residents, evacuation plan safe practices, and involve the community in these efforts. If your goal is to reduce wildfire risk, maybe your objective is to remove and thin overgrown vegetation and underbrush in priority areas. And maybe another objective is to use manual and mechanical thinning, controlled burns, and hand crews to reduce these fuels to achieve that goal. Okay? So there is a delineation there, and you want to do a good job of describing this, because a well-articulated answer here is going to be well received by the review committee if you are clearly stating these things and they make sense. They need to be reasonable. So forest fuels reduction projects, you should be describing the pre and post treatment description. So what are the preconditions and what are the desired post conditions? And how does this relate to your goals as a Firewise community or our goals as a community as a whole to reduce overall wildfire risk in our community? Really, for all project types, you do need to provide a clear rationale for how the proposed project will reduce the risks and associated, excuse me. You do need to provide a clear rationale for how your project's going to address these issues in the community. So how are you going to reduce the risk associated with wildfire, or how is this project going to educate and prepare the community for wildfire? You also want to identify additional assets at risk that will benefit from this project. Do you have critical infrastructure within or near your project? Are there power lines, communication infrastructure, stuff like that? The next part in the scope of work are project deliverables. And these are measurable metrics for the evaluation of the project. This is what we are using to determine if you are meeting the intent of your project. So when you're reporting to us and you're invoicing us, we are looking at your project deliverables and making sure you are meeting those deliverables. So what are deliverables? Those are basically on the ground treatments or expected kind of milestones. So what are the acres to be treated? How many community members are you planning to engage? How many homes could potentially be affected by your project? Basically, any details that help the review committee understand the intent and scope of your project. You should also consider in your scope of work presenting a scalable project to allow for some flexibility for the review team. So for example, we recommend that you propose a couple different options to the review committee. One might be the preferred number of acres that you would like to treat and the associated costs. And option 2 might be a reduced project with less acres and a lower cost. And that just gives some flexibility to the review team to try to spread that money out as best we can. The last part of the scope of work is the implementation plan and schedule of events. So you do need to provide a tentative implementation timeline. It can be bullet points, basically addressing specific tasks and milestones so that we can help measure progress during the implementation. And this helps demonstrate your readiness. So to wrap up the scope of work is also worth 10 points, and the evaluation criteria is clearly listed. I'll just say, we are awarding points based on the applicant's ability to write a well-articulated scope of work. And you need to clearly demonstrate that the project is appropriate for the program and how the project will improve wildfire resiliency, community protection, and reduce risks. So let's talk about the budget. This is kind of the next step, and the budget is very important. A detailed budget must be provided using the spreadsheet available online in the resources tab. And you really do need to be thoughtful here. You need to be thinking about all potential costs associated with completing your project. We cannot reimburse for any costs that are not reflected in the budget. We can entertain amendments down the road if there are changes that need to be that need to happen. But if you send us an invoice for something that you're expecting reimbursement for, and that's not listed as a cost in the budget, we can't pay that. We need to make sure that those costs are reflected. So let's run through an example here real quick. So it's important to remember that there's budget categories and we need to use this correctly. So let's run through an example. So most people who are private landowners, there are different buckets in this budget. Okay, there's salary and wages, employee benefits. This would be more fitting for a nonprofit organization that actually has staff salaries that they need to pay for to get the project done. But if I'm a private landowner and I'm going to do some project management work for Match, I might put that in there, right? Project management, Match, basically volunteer work for project management. And you want to look at this, this column up here. We have, what is the grant share that you're asking for? If you are calling this match, this goes into grantee match bucket. So say you're anticipating, 20 hours of your time. I think the going rate is $31.50. That's going to auto-populate in the Truckee Fire grant share, but you want to pull that over to match. So that's going to be $630 in match. If I'm a private landowner, I'm not going to have any benefits, but I'm probably going to have quite a bit of contractual costs, right? So I'm probably going to have an RPF on staff or on contract, and they're going to charge me $100 an hour, and it's going to be 25 hours, or let's just call it 50 hours. And then I'm going to have a fuel reduction contractor, right? And they're going to charge me per acre. I have 100 acres. They're going to charge me $4,000 an acre. Okay. So that's all uploading, auto-populating into Truckee Fire's grant share. Now, if you were to propose some match here, say you're going to pay for the RPF out of pocket, you would move that money over to grant match and you would delete that from Truckee Fire's grant share, right? And so now we're tallying up what your match is and what you're committing to, and also what we're committing to from the grant. And so if you're asking for $400,000 and you're going to bring $5,000 in match, then your total project's $405,603. If you're a nonprofit organization and you need some indirect costs, that's acceptable. If we get budgets from private landowners trying to claim 10%, indirect costs, then that's going to be kindly deleted from your budget and explain to you why we're not giving out money in indirect costs to private landowners. Indirect costs are meant for professional organizations that have bills to pay, that have administrative staff assisting with reporting and completing the project. It is not meant for a free pass to get some money in your pocket. So supplies and equipment, there's a distinction here. Supplies are anything less than $5,000 per unit cost. So if I need to, I'm just going to throw out an example. This probably isn't very applicable, but chainsaws are usually about $1,200. So a chainsaws would be supplies, food, whatever supplies that are a unit cost less than $5,000. Equipment is anything greater than that. So if you're proposing to purchase equipment, you are putting your equipment ask in here. So if I'm proposing a masticator purchase to support fuel reduction projects, that's where you're putting that line item in the budget. I went through that very quickly. If there are any questions, I'm here for support. Usually the budget is slightly confusing for people, so I'm happy to work through that with you if needed. But please try to work through that thoughtfully and put the right things in the right buckets. There's also a budget narrative associated with your budget spreadsheet, and this is really to help the review team make informed decisions. So the budget narrative, it allows for additional justification of how and or why a budget line item helps to meet the project deliverables. So you are going to list in bullets every single line item you have in the budget that you are requesting funding for, and quickly detail how that funding will support meeting the grant objectives. You should also demonstrate in your budget narrative that costs are appropriate for the proposed activity. So if you have costs that are identified as higher than usual, you should explain any special circumstances within the project that makes these increased costs necessary to achieve the goals of the project. This does not have to be a dissertation, but it needs to provide enough detail that the review committee understands what each line item is going towards in the project. To wrap this up, the budget's worth 5 points. And again, we're looking at clear depiction of the costs and justification that they are reasonable for the project. Okay, moving forward to project readiness and environmental compliance. This will be the last talk or last subject here today. So readiness is demonstrated by showing that you are ready to begin implementation immediately. Again, we mentioned this in the last webinar. We want projects to be implemented in the same fiscal year that they are awarded. So this generally means completing the following actions before applying. We talked about, completing environmental compliance, or at least having it ready to submit. And this is common practice where in grant writing world, sometimes we're hesitant to submit some of these permits without guarantee that we're going to have the funding. And since you're not guaranteed funding until the review committee, unless you're selected by the review committee, sometimes people opt to have the environmental compliance documented, basically completed to the point where it's ready for submission. And then if you receive the grant funding, you can press submit to the state and get compliance quickly. And you can demonstrate that in the narrative that you are ready to submit your document, it is completed, and you are ready to implement upon being awarded funding. You should also, obviously, as we talked about, have an RPF committed to the project. And you should probably complete some type of competitive bidding. It's not required, but you should have a contractor selected. So, solicit some bids, get some quotes, and have a contractor selected for your project. And you can tell them that you're not willing to sign a contract until you are, sure that you are going to receive funding. But you just want to get it set up so that if you do get funding, you can execute that contract and get that contractor to work immediately, or as soon as possible based on their schedule. You should also have all necessary letters of commitment, agreements, and right of entry in place. So there are, prompts in the application asking you to describe any permits or regulatory approvals required for environmental compliance, who's going to complete these permits, what is the timeline, what is the document type. If you are unsure about any of this, you should reach out to me. Just to highlight again, competitive bids are not required, but they are strongly encouraged. This does offer an open and competitive bidding process, which should drive prices down or at least introduce some competitive pricing. This process with bidding, it can occur after the grant is awarded. But again, if you want to demonstrate readiness, you should probably have this done before applying. And if your entity has a procurement policy, if you're a professional organization or a nonprofit, please follow your procurement policy. So to wrap this one up, project readiness is worth 5 points. I'm not going to read that. It's in the procedural guide. Okay, to wrap this up, I'm going to say this at every grant webinar that we have. You must read the procedural guide in its entirety. The procedural guide is different than the project workbook, just to be clear. All the information presented today and at all these workshop series are clearly articulated in the procedural guide. So to be successful, you really got to dig into that, understand it, follow the procedures. I think it's really important to understand where you're at in this project planning process that I described to you today. Developing a competitive project from scratch, as I mentioned, can take multiple years, and you really can't rush this with your community. So where are you at? Are you starting with a concept and you haven't even talked to any of your neighbors? Or are you at a spot where you've got support, you've got some budget ideas, you've got a scope of work, and you're kind of ready to work on this application and get a submittal into us? Where are you at? Remember that this grant program will be available every year until Measure T expires, and we're here to help you. I am here to help you. Again, I do not participate in the selection or the ranking of these projects. I am here as a resource to you to help you get through this process. I do not select projects. I mentioned this last time, there are other programs out there to consider. So if you're a large landowner, you should be considering the CFIP program. This is a cost share program from the state, and it is a really great program. So if you think that you are interested in CFIP, reach out to me. We'll get you set up with the forester to get you through that process. There's also a federal cost share program, which I'm not sure the status of that with the current happenings in the federal government, but they do have a program as well called EQIP, the Environmental Quality Improvement Program. And Nevada County OES does offer a micro grant program to Firewise communities, road associations, and HOAs. So there are other options out there. We like to remind people that this is not your only option for receiving funding. We do have a couple upcoming workshops. March 20th, we'll talk about how to be competitive. So we'll talk about landscape level context, vulnerable populations, administrative capacity, and local assessments. And April 3rd, we'll talk about submitting your application and mapping. I should mention that if you need any assistance with mapping, please just reach out to me and I can make maps for you at any time. I'm happy to do that for anybody that is looking to apply to this program. We do have resources available on our website. And of course, you can always contact me or Eric with any information or any questions you might have. So with that, we've got about 15 minutes for question and answer. I saw several things getting in the chat, so maybe I'll have Brittany kind of prompt me on some things here, and I'll look through the chat as well and make sure that we're getting these questions answered. If anybody wants to raise their hand now, now is the time to do so.
Great job, Dillon. Yeah, people have asked a lot of really good questions within the chat, so I'll just start throwing some at you. Okay, our first question was, what field studies or reports are needed to support a notice of exemption or initial study / mitigated negative declaration?
So this is very site specific. Looks like this is a question from Adrian. So it depends, Adrian, and I know that's not a great question, but it really does depend on what actions you are proposing. Are you proposing, light touch treatments, low impact equipment, hand thinning, chipping, mastication? There is no clear process for CEQA. It is kind of this nebulous process. It's discretionary. But since you have a forester on staff at the HOA, the forester, we are trained to tackle all of these things you're asking about. So field studies, biological studies, these are processes that we have. They're CNDB queries. It's stuff specific to Truckee Fire's processes and procedures. So I can talk in depth to that with Adrian offline and try to make sure that you guys are prepared and work with Bill on that, if that satisfies that question, Adrian. Moving on, what else we got?
Yeah, next question. We have a couple in regard to the review process. First question is, are in-kind and cash matches considered equally when scoring a proposal?
Yes. I mean, you're going to be limited on the amount of in-kind that you can bring to the table. We're not going to entertain in-kind match where it's like private property owners doing work around their house in the defensible space zone. It introduces just too much complexity and liability to the contractor. So your best chance for bringing in the most match to get to that 20% is bringing cash to the table. I think it's going to be hard to justify 300 hours of in-kind match for project management. It's not going to take you that long to work through this process.
Great. Another question. Are there requirements to support or document indirect costs / a specific indirect cost rate?
So we've set that arbitrarily at Truckee Fire at 10%. Some organizations or some grantors will entertain a negotiated indirect cost rate, but we have decided to cap the indirect costs at 10%. So you can't go over that.
Perfect. That's super clear. Alrighty, next question also from Deborah Kustek. Can the review committee discuss scaling options with an applicant if the presented options don't quite align with the available funding after other awards are made?
Where is that question?
Deborah asked it at
Okay.
331.
Is the review committee able to discuss with an applicant scaling options beyond those presented? No, the review committee is not. The review committee is recommending projects for funding to the fire chief and the board of directors, and they are making their own decisions based on our budget constraints and our limited funding. They are making their own decisions on which projects to fund and at what level to fund it at. So that is not something that is negotiable or something that the review committee discusses with applicants.
Great. Next question from Adrian Juncosa. He said, a quick online search shows the value of volunteer time in California varying from $30 to about $38. Can you provide a specific number that can be used straight from the source?
I'll have to write that one down and get back to you on that. I'm sure there's a state website. If anybody knows what that state, it's probably. Last I saw, it was like 3150, but I will write that down as an action item and make sure that we make that clear at the next webinar.
Great. I'll also capture that for you, Dillon. Next question. If the project is focused around community preparedness, what do you recommend for the project readiness section?
That's a great question. So if who asked that question? Oh,
And
if we are focusing on community preparedness, what do I recommend? Have you engaged with those communities? I think that's a letter of support type situation where we're demonstrating that we've outreached to the community and that they want the work to happen or the project to happen. That's a really good question.
Can I chime in since I asked this question?
Yeah.
Like for competitive bid, can we just put like not applicable?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think
But
Taylor,
focus on like the collaborative nature and letters of support. Okay.
yeah. And then like, do you have meeting spaces figured out? Do you have a plan for specific days for community events? Do you have those already kind of established and are those on your schedule?
Great. Thank
Does
you.
that help, Ann? Okay.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Next question from Susie Hosenbath. Are there requirements for the contractor to implement the fuels reduction work? Do they need to be an LTO or do they just need to have a business license?
So, yeah, good question, Susie. I mean, obviously, if you're filing a timber harvest plan exemption, then you need to have an LTOA. So for the rest of us that aren't foresters here, if you're doing a commercial project, there is a specialty license that the California Board of Forestry requires, and that is a licensed timber operator A license. So that's any work that is commercial in nature, which should be permitted by a forester. If it's a CEQA project and it's not commercial, the contractor needs to be licensed properly in the state of California and have adequate insurance and liability insurance. Usually it's 1 million general, 2 million aggregate.
Next question from David Galson. Is the application preparation time allowed as in-kind match on a project application?
No. So only costs within the performance period of a grant are eligible to be counted as match. So that is when a grant is executed, usually on July 1st through when the grant expires on June 30th. So no, you cannot claim time for preparing an application as match.
Great. Second question from David. What is the actual end date for completing the project if it's funded through this grant program / this cycle?
On the
When does the
agreement,
project need to be completed?
yeah, so the agreement will be executed on July 1st, 2025, and will expire on June 30th, 2026. But there is some flexibility there. We understand that winter impacts can delay projects, and so we are flexible with that end date, and we can entertain amendments if needed to extend that performance period if it's justifiable. But generally, it's July 1 through June 30.
Really great question from John Ogle here. He said, is there a pathway for groups within this meeting to speak with one another to see if cooperation and collaboration is possible? He's curious if it's possible to share what his nonprofit has to offer and see if that's compatible with other groups that are working to apply for this grant.
That is a good question, John. We have a couple local groups here. So we have a Eastern Regional Firewise Coalition that we're trying to bolster a little bit and get more participation in. And so participating in some of those local committee meetings that are monthly is a good way to get in front of some Firewise communities and motivated members of the community that may be interested in working with you. Otherwise, maybe that's an action item for us to work on to help facilitate some collaboration. I don't know if Maria or Brittany have any other ideas there, but I think Eastern Regional Firewise Coalition or just engaging with Firewise communities or HOAs is the primary way that we, work with communities in our district.
Yeah, I think this is something that we can definitely think on as a team. David, maybe if you just wanted to share the scope of your nonprofit and your email in the chat. Therefore, if people feel particularly connected and resonate with what your nonprofit does, maybe they can reach out to you. And he just said, would it be possible to speak with your team at another time? And would it be possible to suggest connection as
Absolutely, John. Absolutely. We're happy to meet. We have ability to schedule consultation with me. If you send me an email, I'll put my email in the chat, but yeah, we'd be happy to meet.
Okay, Rob Carr just sent a question. If a residential community containing several single-family homes seeks to pursue a project to remove trees located close to structures, trees near power lines, and unhealthy trees, would an RPF be needed? Or would it be acceptable to have an International Society of Arboriculture certified arborists work on the project?
So let's be clear here first that projects within 100 feet of structures, as defined by Public Resource Code 4291 as the defensible space zone, is not eligible for funding with this grant opportunity. Work within 100 feet of structures and residential communities is the responsibility legally of the landowner. And we're trying to develop some other programs through Measure T, such as a dead tree removal fund and other options for the community. But if you are considering a project of that scope, from what you are describing, I don't know that that would be an eligible project for us if it's within 100 feet of structures. But the ultimate answer is yes. Anytime you are proposing to do any work in forested environments in California, you need to have an RPF on staff or on contract. Arboriculture, arborists are not qualified to the level of a registered professional forester, not even close, to make decisions in the forest on what is a good action and what is a bad action. So yes, you always need a forester.
Another quick comment in regard to that question. Rob, if there are trees near power lines, you could also reach out directly to that power company because that should be their responsibility. So if you need help doing that, feel free to reach out to DSpace at Truckee Fire or Dillon, and he can put you in contact with Maria or I, and we can put you in the right direction for taking care of those trees near power lines. That is currently the last question we have in the chat, and I'm not seeing any hands raised. So we have about 2 minutes until 4. So if anyone does have any additional questions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll do a quick call on you. Otherwise, as a reminder, you can always set up a consultation with Dillon and or pop into the office to chat with us in person. Maria has her hand raised.
Hi guys, I dropped a link into the chat that I think is the source of the value of volunteer time, which is independent sector. And I thought if possible for Dillon to confirm that while we're still on the chat, then people can take advantage of that information.
Yeah, that's the source I use. Thanks, Maria.
Yep. So it's that independentsector.org, everybody, that is dropped in the chat to find the value of volunteer hours.
Awesome. I also see that John Ogle dropped his contact information into the chat as he works for Great Basin Institute, also known as GBI. So for folks interested in engaging with him, his information is in the chat.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. That was a great webinar. I appreciate the attendance. And please reach out if you have any questions, and we'll see you next week.